But on we move. Before the coffee break, we have the ABC of XYZ. Understanding digital advertising impact across the generations here in Australia. So we hear a lot about the X-Gen, we hear a lot about millennials, and we also now hear about these new Gen Zs and how they're changing the game when it comes to marketing and advertising. We've heard a bit about that over the last 2 days. But is there much evidence to support these claims, and are they really that different from older Australians? Researchers from the Marketing Scientists Group have produced a brand new study into digital advertising effectiveness for generations X, Y, and Z, using a complex experiment design that blends survey responses with passive data. Our next presenter has worked with some of the largest media brands, including senior roles at Turner Broadcasting System and Yahoo 7. He and his team work with clients across Australia and Asia in the areas of audience measurement, digital video, customer experience, as well as advertising content effectiveness. His work is regularly featured in trade media, at conferences throughout the Asia-Pacific region, and he is published in the Journal of Advertising Research. And he's right here today at DigiMarcon. Please welcome, joining us on the stage, Managing Director of Marketing Scientists Group, Peter Hammer.
What an introduction. Lovely to be here today. As you've heard, my name is Pete, and I am a marketing scientist. So you're probably wondering, what exactly is a marketing scientist? And I would love to know too, if we can change to the next slide. We'll just jump back. Oh, we don't have the front slide. We'll just continue. So you're probably wondering, what exactly is a marketing scientist? And sadly, I don't get to wear an uber cool lab coat or play with explosive chemicals. But like all good scientists, I use data and evidence to explain the world around us. And today we'll be exploring that weird and wonderful creature that has eluded us marketers for many years now, the millennial, and we'll do so in the context of its older counterpart, Generation X, and that new age demo sweeping the nation, Generation Z, which is why we've called this presentation the ABC of X, Y, and Z, and we're going to be understanding influencers, audio and video across the different generations. And why are we doing this? Well, that's because we work with some of the largest media brands in the world, and they're really confused about this too, because they're getting lots of questions from within their own business. They're hearing from their clients. They're being told that you need to market really differently when it's talking about these younger generations. But is there any evidence to this? That's what we wanted to explore, because we certainly hear certain big claims like this. So for instance, this was published in Forbes that millennials have turned traditional marketing strategy on its head, requiring an entirely new approach. And some marketers are so confused by millennials, they've just given up on them entirely. So this has come from a research company, Vision Critical, saying that since millennials are ruining everything, it's no surprise more companies are investing more of their marketing dollars into Generation Z. But they also add to that Generation Z, or Generation Z, is changing the marketing game as well. So what do we do? So no doubt many of you have been sitting in boardrooms, something like this. You know, what do we know about Generation Z so we can get them to buy more stuff? And pretty much the only thing we know is that they hate brands that try and get them to buy more stuff. So I'm here today to hopefully debunk some of those myths, to bring some of this data and evidence to the table to really help us understand, are they that different? Do we need to completely revisit our strategy, turn it on its head? Or are there some key facts that we can take into our marketing and business strategy to drive brand growth? And so the study we'll be talking about today has come from a big piece of work we did with one of our partners called the Cost Optimized Baseline Study. It's a series of different pieces of research, but it's really about understanding customers so that we can optimize our marketing strategy and ultimately grow brands. So the main data set that we'll be talking across today has around 1,500 people in it. The age groups we'll be talking about is from 14 through to 54, and it's nationally representative. So we wanted to make sure that we had kind of all the bases covered, so across all the major capital cities, but also the regional areas. And I guess the key thing about that, it means that we're getting a clear Australian snapshot of these different generations. So you often hear these big claims about certain studies and certain facts, and this is the amount of search that we'll be seeing coming up. But this is an actual picture of the whole population of Australia to give us an accurate view of where things are heading. Now, because we'll be talking about the generations so much today, I thought I'd define them up front. So Generation Z for us starts at age 14 through to 21. Now, technically, it does go a little bit younger than that, but that's because we're proper researchers, and so we have to follow the code of practice when it comes to researching, which is why we start at 14. But there's still 2.6 million of these people in Australia, so we've got a pretty meaty sample or population to cover. Following to that, we'll have millennials, which is 22 through to 37. There's about 5.5 million of those. And then finally, Generation X, which is 38 through to 54, with a similar number. And in terms of the key topics we'll cover today, we're trying to look at some of those new areas of marketing, those areas where we're getting loads of questions. So we'll be talking about social media and influencers. We've heard a bit about influencer marketing today, and we'll hopefully debunk a few things sitting around there. We want to talk about some podcasts. We'll be talking about voice assistants, and we heard particularly in the panel session a lot about voice search and the size of voice search, so we'll give you some accurate, nationally representative data on that. And finally, we'll finish with video and advertising. So I want you to all sit back, relax, buckle up though, because it's going to be a bumpy ride as we journey through the generations X, Y, and Z. And we'll start with social media and influencers. So because when it comes to marketing in 2019, it's all about the influencers. It's all about KK and KJ and getting your brands integrated in a really authentic way. But what we wanted to do is actually start to have a look at that. Because certainly a lot of brands think this is the hot go-to strategy. I mean, there was some work from another research company, Global Web Index, that said influencer marketing has become the hot go-to strategy for many brands. And there's no better generation for this than the Gen Z crew. So based on this, if you're trying to reach after this audience, you must be doing influencer marketing, right? You must have that really authentic content. You've kind of partnered up with some celebrities that are going to really bring an authentic, true voice to your brand. Because it's something like this, that, you will get some, celebrity who, of course, authentically uses your products, because her life isn't complete without the lip gloss. It's not complete without these hair vitamins and protein shake and... if the clicker goes, the unicycle scooter and the accounting software and the brand of ice cream and the leaf blower, because it's really, we hear authentic. So what we wanted to really do is to understand how this influencer marketing is working within the market and get a picture of what's actually going on. So we'll start firstly with social media, because obviously influencers only work if you're talking about social media. If we look at the whole population, 14 through to 54, 74% have claimed to have used social media in the last week. And that number actually aligns very closely with the official digital currency here in this market, which is run by Nielsen. We also looked at that by the different generations. And what's interesting is there's not as much difference as you might think. So that 74 number becomes 81% if you're talking about Generation Z, 73% for millennials, and 73% too for Generation X. But of course, it's not just general social media use, it's also those different brands. And we hear a lot about how Facebook is dead, dying, and buried, and we should really be moving off that platform. But we wanted to debunk that myth. So what we did is we took this same group of people and asked them about what kind of platforms they were actually using. So if we look at the number, this is now people who have used social media. We see that Facebook is still far and away the number one. So 89% of social media users had used Facebook in the last week. You can see Instagram there, 51%, Snapchat, 33%, so on and so forth. Now this starts to get a little bit more interesting. Hold your cameras because you want to see the next slide. It's the one where we look at the different generations. So here's the same data split by those different groups. And you can see Facebook's still really big, but the real difference is we're starting to see more from Instagram and Snapchat in terms of that daily usage. So this really speaks to, yes, it is the right place we should be when it comes to influencers and that kind of space, because that's the right platforms where they're on. And in particular, if you look at the blue bar, that's our Generation Z group, we actually see the same number of people actually using those platforms across Instagram and Snapchat as they are Facebook. So again, understanding why it's so important to be in that space. But we didn't want to just look at platform usage, we actually wanted to look at the impact of influencer marketing. And so like all good scientists, we strapped on our lab coats and we conducted an experiment. So what we did is we sent people into an environment that we could control, where we were sending them into a social feed. There was a whole bunch of different social photo posts, so very similar to Instagram. It was conducted on a smartphone. But what's also really interesting about that data is that we had a bunch of big-name celebrity posts. So we had some authentic organic posts where they just naturally put a brand in. We also had some paid partnership posts where it was the marketers, those marketers, they get involved, they like to ensure that the brand messaging is right, the colors are right, all of that stuff. And so we were able to then compare the impact of general influencer posts, but also those paid and organic posts. We also wanted to look at it using standardized metrics. So again, I'm a bit of a research nerd. You hear, I'm published here and there, and I'm really kind of finicky about making sure we measure things exactly the same way. Because as marketers, we're not just using one platform, we're using a whole lot of platforms. So we used a standardized ad metric, brand recall, to be able to compare this influencer marketing. And this is what the results show. So this is now overall in terms of influencer posts by the different generations. And we see when they're exposed to it, so again, we're controlling for exposure here, Generation Z actually does respond better to influencer marketing. So this is really good news. If we are going down this strategy to be able to target these guys, we actually see greater impact. But again, being good scientists, we didn't want to just stop there. We wanted to dig a bit deeper. And so what we did is we then looked at the followers, because as we know, the following is actually a big key difference in terms of where the impact is. And this is what the data proves as well, that if someone is a follower of their brand, they're much more likely to respond. They're much more likely to recall that brand. And part of the reason we saw the difference in the last slide to do with the different generations is simply because they're much more likely to be followers of those big name celebrities. So when it comes to Generation Z, out of those top 10, 36% are following at least one, compared to 21% for millennials and just 4% for Generation X. What this tells us is that we really need to understand a lot more about those followers. And so people are jumping on Instagram left, right, and center, but do you know who you're actually reaching, who the actual audience is, and are they relevant for your brand? I would question probably not, because there's not a lot of data, not a lot of transparency in this space, but we're starting to see more tools and systems come through. So as marketers, if you're in this space, I definitely recommend you go down that path. Now, as I said before, we didn't only look at, paid brand partnerships, so where the marketers had got involved. We also looked at organic posts, so where a brand had been put into the mix. And is that really authentic post much more effective? Well, the answer is actually no. So looking across the 3 different generations on terms of that recall metric again, we see the red line, which is paid partnerships, was much more effective. So what this tells us is that we don't want to go and chase and be organic and viral and all of that stuff. We want to treat it like marketing, because when we treat it like an ad and a paid partnership and we tick all those brand messages, we actually get a better brand result, which is, at the end of the day, why we're spending this money. So what are our key takeouts from this section? So the first one is social media is important for all generations. So yes, for the younger ones for sure, but also for the older ones too. And certainly don't kill off Facebook. It's still the largest brand across all the generations. And certainly though, we do want to think about Instagram and Snapchat for the younger guys. And particularly around this influencer post, we did see those greater uplifts, but it's largely due to the followers. So again, get more information around those followers and really understand who you're reaching, because that's going to be the biggest determinant of what has impact. Finally, don't be scared of using this like a marketing platform. What we saw is that those paid partnership posts were actually more effective when it comes to key brand metrics, so you want to actually leverage it and take control and make sure that your key messages are being lifted. Those authentic, organic posts aren't necessarily going to do a lot for your brand. Okay, let's go on to our next area, which is podcasts. Now, I've got a little bit of a confession to make. In the last kind of year or so, I've become a bit of a podaholic, as I think many have in the kind of media marketing trade world. We're all a bit obsessed about talking about, this is the podcast that I'm listening to, and have you heard this podcast, and do you want to be on my podcast? That's the kind of podcast world we live in. I've been one scene. And this is kind of what it's become, that we're almost like so obsessed within the industry about podcasts that we need to have conversation about podcasts because she's just had a conversation about being on podcasts. It's that kind of world we're in. But does it apply to the general population? How does this look when we look at the whole Australian 14 to 54? So again, going to our big nationally representative data set, we saw, for instance, before I get there, Reuters told us that one of the key trends that we want to look for too is younger people. But let's, again, look at the main population, which is of 14 through to 54, 20% have claimed to have listened to podcasts in the past week. So, again, that's a pretty decent number for a medium that's still pretty new in the space. And is it true what Reuters say that it is skewing younger? Well, the answer also is slightly yes. So we see that millennials, 24% have claimed to have listened in the last week, compared to 21% for Generation Z. And for Generation X, we see it's at still reasonably high, but 14%. We were also interested in what kind of content translates as well. Now, we hear a lot about true crime, and Teacher's Pet has been a runaway success here in Australia, and a lot of controversy around it too. But actually what we found was that comedy was king. So of the market share of podcasts that are actually translating into usage, we see that 24% of all the podcasts listened to were of the comedy genre. True crime actually sits in the red section, which is news, business, and politics, but a subset of that. So again, not as big as perhaps what the media reports. And what's really interesting about the blue one, comedy, is that if you look at the different generations, we see that it's particularly the case for the younger people. So 37% of that genre share is comedy for Generation Z, 26% for millennials, and just 13% for the Generation X there. But again, as marketers, it's rarely we're a one-trick pony. We're usually using lots of different forms. And so in the audio medium, we're thinking about not just podcasts, but total audio. And so the next question you've got to ask, well, how does radio fit into this? How does the usage of podcasts compare to traditional audio usage? Are they the same people? And are they actually getting the same kind of reach? Well, let's look into that. So here's the exact same data we looked at before. So the exact same number, 21, 24, and 14. That's for podcasts. And this is how it compares with radio. So again, even though it's a big medium, it's certainly growing. There's a lot of reports to suggest this is the case. If you're thinking about total audio, don't forget about radio, because it's 13 percentage points higher for Generation Z and millennials, and almost 4 times greater for Generation X. So if you want to reach these guys, you still need to rely on the good old wireless. But there is some good news. And so one of the really good pieces of news is that it's not necessarily the same people. So from this data set, we're able to look at those who listen to radio, those who listen to podcasts, and those who listen to both. And this is this data here. So what we see is that obviously radio is still bigger, and 35% listen to radio only, 11% listen to podcasts only, and just 8% listen to both. And why that's really cool and interesting from a marketer point of view, I know looking at reach is really sexy, but I guess one of the key things here is we see that there's an incremental reach gain by using podcasts. So you're actually reaching new people and therefore being able to push your message out to a broader group of people. So this is really exciting for podcasts. It means that even though you're actually, it's again a similar medium, you're actually reaching different people. But of course, again, we're marketers, so we want to know what is the ad impact? How does that translate? So we know the usage is lower, but is the ad impact a bit greater? Well, sadly, it's not the case. So we looked at 13 different product categories and stated impact of ads. This is the number for podcasts, and this is the number for radio. So not only have we got a usage problem, but we also have an ad impact problem. So again, if I'm a marketer right here and right now in the audio space, I should still be investing more in radio. Now, it's not to say that we're against podcasts. We think there's a really bright future ahead. And one of the challenges here is there aren't the same formats available. It's still really difficult to buy as a marketer to get into the podcast formats. It's pretty much just live reads still. So we expect to see that to grow. But if I'm spending my money next quarter or the next half, I'd be thinking a lot more about radio when we're thinking about a total marketing budget for audio. So what are our key takeouts here? Well, the first one is that podcast usage was higher for Generation Z and millennials as compared to Gen X. So again, if you are trying to reach those audiences, there is a slight advantage there. And make them laugh. We saw that comedy was actually a really high appeal. What's really interesting is we do a lot of stuff in video too, and we've seen that same finding, that comedy actually translates much better with the younger audiences, particularly on TV and SVOD. But don't forget about radio, because what we see is the usage is greater and also the ad impact is greater too. So again, thinking about that for all generations, we should definitely be thinking about a total audio strategy, not just podcasts. Okay, let's switch gears now. We've done a bit of listening. Let's talk about some talking. By that I mean voice assistants. Now, we've heard quite a few times already today the importance of voice into the future, and certainly there's a lot of people who are very bullish on this. I don't know if anyone follows kind of Keith Weed. He's the ex-CMO of Unilever, but he's very, very bullish in this being the future of e-commerce. It may look something like this, that you might want to be, ordering a Kleenex from your Amazon Echo, who might actually have some other ideas about what it is. Often that might become quite persuasive. Sometimes you really want to put your foot down, but really you just end up talking about the weather, which is really what all of us do on Google Home. But what we wanted to do is, I guess, understand this market, because we hear a lot of numbers, kind of thrown left, right, and center. But if we actually look at a nationally representative picture, how does it look? Because there's certainly lots of reports like this one. This was a specific kind of Internet of Technology App Dynamics report that focused on some high innovative people, and those really innovative people were using it. 71% say they use it on a daily basis. But the problem is they're not representative. They don't look at the whole population. And a lot of the research in this space is focused on those innovators and not the general population. So we wanted to look at that. So here's the same data, again, from our study, looking at voice assistants. So not 71% daily, 1 in 3 in the last month have claimed to be using voice assistants kind of on a regular basis. And there's not a lot of difference by the different generations. So if you're thinking this is a way to really engage young people, we're not necessarily seeing that in the data. So 38% for Gen Z, 36% for millennials, and 32% there for Generation X. And I guess we were also interested, though, are there other factors at play here? And one of the key ones that we keep hearing about is technology. So if someone has access to a Google Home or an Amazon Echo, are they actually more likely to make a request? It kind of makes sense that they would. And that's what our data supports too. So if we look at those same people, those who have a smart speaker in their home versus those who don't, we see a massive uplift, 2.5 times as many requests in the past month. So what this tells us is that it's much more to do with the technology rather than the age of the person in terms of the usage at this time. And part of the reason we don't see a lot of differences between the different generations is because we actually don't see a lot of difference in access for smart speakers by the different generations at this point. Like before, though, we were also interested in the types of activities people are using smart speakers and other forms of voice assistants for. Spoiler alert, there's no marketing going to be in this next slide, because I guess there's a lot of assumption that this is the way the future is, and that's all the conversations we want to have with our smart speakers is for marketing purposes. Sadly not. So here is the top 4. So in number 4, it's search and information requests, and I love that little anecdote about asking who the tallest person was. That's an exact kind of thing that would be shared here in search and information. So an information type request that usually has a binary type answer or a specific answer. Number 3, hopefully you speak to it and it sings back, because we've got radio, podcasts, and playing music. Number 2 is a bit like talking to my parents, talking about the weather. And number 1 is phone calls and messages, which we were initially a little bit concerned about. We thought, what's going on here? So maybe there's something wrong with the data. But then we actually looked at how people are making the requests, and we found that 66% of the last requests actually happened on a smartphone or tablet. So again, people are using it to do a simple message, or they're using it to get it to dial a certain person. So again, we're not seeing this kind of mass usage for full kinds of conversations or complex conversations. It's really very kind of function-led rather than much else. But again, we wanted to know, was there differences by the different generations? We haven't seen much in total usage, but maybe there's differences in how they speak to it. The answer, or the shorter answer, is not really. So we didn't see any difference with weather. We didn't see any differences with searches for information. We saw some slight differences in terms of the phone call and messaging functions, so slightly higher for millennials and Gen X. Also, when it comes to music and radio, we saw an increase there amongst the Gen Z group compared to the other 2. But if we put this in the context of technology, so instead of looking at age like we are here, but actually look at the technology or device used to make this request, this is where we see the big differences. So we see that playing music and radio and podcasts is much higher on a smart speaker compared to a smartphone or tablet device. And requests relating to phone calls and messages much more likely to happen on a smartphone and tablet. So this is not to say that age isn't important. There are certainly some small differences, but there's some much bigger differences being driven by technology. So if you're playing in this space, really focus there. Focus on the kind of technology in your customers' hands and work out where the trends are in terms of adoption of the relevant technology. So as an FYI, every Christmas there's a big bump in Google Homes and Amazon Echoes as they go more into the market. So keep a lookout for January as you might see a surge in spike in searches coming through. So what are our key takeouts here? So number one, voice assistant usage was similar for all the ages, as is smart speaker access. And that really leads us on to number two, which was that technology was really driving the differences there, that we saw there were much more requests coming through for smart speakers. And that's, again, if we see changes in that technology, that's going to be the big driver. But number three, again, related to this, technology is the bigger driver rather than age. So in terms of the types of requests being made, really focus on your strategy around the technology rather than the specific person that you're trying to reach to. Okay, our last area is video and advertising. Now, I guess when it comes to young people, we hear a lot about how they don't watch TV anymore. TV's, dead, gone, buried. If you're going to try and do video with young people, don't even attempt to put it on a TV screen. Certainly, if we speak to some digital agencies, that's very much the kind of information we're getting here. Because while people from older generations might use platforms in a similar way across the board, Gen Z is more discerning. YouTube is increasingly becoming their platform of choice for long-form content. Now, we don't disagree with this. We certainly think that there is information to suggest much higher usage, and I'll show some in a minute, around kind of YouTube and similar digital video platforms for young people. But don't do it necessarily at the expense of throwing everything out at the same time or expecting that their viewer behaviour is really different. And I think a lot of businesses have kind of gone down this path that they think they must need to shoehorn their way somehow into getting younger people onto video. So therefore, let's talk to someone who can promote our mortgage business. Just make sure you do it in a really millennial way. But the life actually doesn't work quite like this. But as I said, I wanted to bring data to the table. So first of all, we did a really big separate study to the one that I mentioned around video usage. And we wanted to understand how people were using TV, how they were using subscription video, how they were using, so Netflix, how they were using, iTunes, how they were using YouTube in terms of longer form viewing of content. So not short form video, but actually longer form, like that quote was talking about. And this is what the data showed us. So on a typical day, Generation Z does use a lot more YouTube content for longer form viewing. So 43% compared to 23% for millennials and 14% for Generation X. Now again, we're all marketers in this room and I speak with a lot of marketers, so that's all well and good, but are they watching any ads? So below you can see the percentage of that viewing that contains advertising, and you see that it's still relatively high. So 70% with ads for Generation Z, which is higher than millennials at 66% and 59% for Generation X. But as I said, we're hearing, okay, we need to be in these platforms, and I think this data convinces us, yes, they are using it more, but how does that compare with other forms of long-form video consumption like television? So what I thought I'd do is I'd combine those two stats there to give us a YouTube with ads number. So you can see 30% there for Gen Z, which is half as much for millennials, which is half as much again for Generation X. So this is YouTube with ads. This is the number for TV. So again, definitely agree there's a need for us to be talking about Generation Z with different forms of video, but don't forget about television, because we certainly see for millennials and Gen X it's much greater, but even for the Gen Z group it's still about the same amount. Technically it's even a little bit higher. So again, if we threw the baby out with the bathwater and we stopped using TV, we'd be missing out on some really important reach that we can get from video. Now, one of the conversations I have a lot is about how, again, these age groups are really different because they like to use the platforms in a different way and they respond to advertising in a different way. And they're so different that I can't do what I was doing before because that would be really old and boring. So again, we wanted to strap on our lab coats to do another experiment. But this time, we created an environment very similar to YouTube. So again, a short form piece of viewing content. It had a pre-roll, skippable pre-roll ahead of it, so we could again look at the advertising impact. So again, looking at the different generations and how they respond on different metrics. So again, we'll be talking about brand recall like we were before, but we'll also look at some other ones. So correct branding, so the ability to identify who the ad is for, because if you do an ad that people don't know who it's for, that's a big problem because they'll go and buy someone else, usually your competitor. The other one is we wanted to know likability. So do they actually like the ads a lot more? Because we know, again, from the science and the academic work that actually translates into sales. Okay, so let's talk with brand recall first. So do they respond differently? Well, the answer is not really. So yes, there's difference in platform usage, that I agree with, but once you actually get them on the platform, do they respond differently to ads? No, they actually respond in a very similar way. Technically, they're actually going the other way. But as I said, we had some other metrics, so let's make it a bit simpler and we'll combine our generations together. So we've got millennials and Gen Z in the blue there, Gen X in the yellow. You can see, again, it's the same numbers I just showed you, so not that much difference in brand recall. We also didn't see a lot of difference in correct branding, so again, they're not responding differently. They don't like it any more or less. They like it just the same. Simply, again, it shows that there's not a lot of difference by age. And if you think about that, it makes a lot of sense. But the problem is this is the way that media is largely still bought and sold. I worked in media for about 12 years, and it was funny, even though we had these great technological advances of how to target people, you still got pretty much every brief wanting 25 to 54 grocery buyer kind of thing. And I think that's something that we really need to get on board with because particularly in the digital space, but even coming into traditional medias like addressable TV and similar, there's now some really rich kind of data products available around targeting. And so instead of targeting on age, what if we could target on buyer behavior? So what if we could target people who might be likely to buy a car? Or what if we could target people who had purchased fast food in the last month? What if we could use that buyer behavior? Now, I'm not talking about hyper-targeting. I'm anti that. I'm not talking about sticking a billboard with very personalized messages in the front yard of people in terms of targeting. I'm talking about those more general purchase behaviors that we can get at scale so we're able to understand buyer behavior versus not. So we're going to take that exact same data we just looked before, where there was no difference by age, and see what happens if we target based on buyer behavior. And this is what it shows us, that there's a much bigger impact in terms of brand recall. It's a slightly higher, or still 10% higher in terms of correct branding. So they're more likely to actually know who it's for so they can do something about it. And similarly, it's again the exact same ad creative, but they even like it a bit more simply because it's relevant for them. And that's the key message here, that even though we've had these capabilities, we've still been targeting on age. But actually what this shows is if you can target on relevant buyer behavior, you're actually going to get a much better result for your ads. So our key takeouts here. So number one, that YouTube does have that higher reach amongst those younger generations, but don't forget about TV. It's still big, particularly for millennials and Gen X, but even kind of equal weight when it comes to Generation Z at this point in time. Number two, despite having that higher platform usage, we actually don't see a lot of difference in terms of the ad impact, in terms of how people respond to advertising. What we see is there's a much bigger impact if we target those ads based on buyer behavior, specifically category usage. Okay, so that's it. That's our 4 topics. And you're probably thinking, okay, well, what do I do now? I kind of came to this presentation hoping to know all these secrets that I meant to know about Gen Z and millennials so I can do all this great kind of marketing to them. And I think that's kind of what it all comes down to, that there are some differences worth looking at. So things like the social media brands, so knowing that Insta and Snapchat is more important. We know, for instance, that podcasts actually skew slightly younger, so particularly if we want to go there. We know that YouTube usage actually is higher amongst this group. But that doesn't mean that we should necessarily, when it comes to influencers, be just focusing on organic. We need to be thinking about paid posts. We need to be thinking about technology when it comes to smart speakers. We need to be thinking about radio when it comes to other forms of total audio. And we certainly need to be thinking about buyer behavior when we're targeting different individuals. So my key message here is don't go out and strap on a Pokemon costume to go and chase after Gen Z and millennials. I want you to all to keep calm and do some science. Because through science, by investigating, by looking at the data and actually looking at what the findings are telling us, we can make much better decisions for our brands and ultimately drive brand growth, which is what we're all in the business of doing. It's been a real pleasure being here today. Thank you so much for letting me speak. I'm between you and cake right now, so I won't hold anything up. But if you do want to have a chat, you can visit me on my website, and we've got more stuff there, or you can chat with me in the foyer. So thanks so much.